Hello everyone, I'm Richard Boogs, I'm Dean of Alumni, and I want to welcome you to this faculty talk as part of our CIIS 50-year anniversary. As you know, CIIS turned 50 years old last week, April 8th, 1968, CIIS was born. So tonight, we'll hear two members of our CIIS community, Rick Tarnas and Matt Segall, who will represent two different generations discussing the gradual transformation of the CIIS mission from its beginning in April '68, when the focus was especially inspired by fertile East-West dialogue, to our current time when many more players are at the table. A little bit about Rick. He's the founding director of the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. Teaches courses in cultural history, archetypal studies, depth psychology, history of philosophy, and religious evolution. He is the author of The Passion of the Western Mind, the history of the Western worldview from the ancient Greeks to the postmodern. His second book, Cosmos and Psyche, Intimations of a New Worldview, received the Book of the Year prize from the Scientific and Medical Network and is the basis for the upcoming documentary film called Changing of the Gods. What does that do, Changing of the Gods?
Well, they just did advanced screening of it. It's turned into a 10-episode series, so it'll probably be later this year.
Fantastic. Look forward to that. He is past president of the International Transpersonal Association and served for many years on the board of governors for the CGU Institute of San Francisco. And Matt Segall teaches in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program and is the author of Physics of the World Soul, the relevance of Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy of organism to contemporary scientific cosmology, and The Reemergence of Schelling, Philosophy in a Time of Emergency. He's also written several other books and essays on a variety of topics ranging from economics and ecology to transpersonal psychology, psychedelics, and religious studies. He is the manager of the Provost office here at CIIS, and in the fall will teach a course called Mind and Nature in German Idealism. Please welcome Rick and Matt.
Listening to Matt's biography makes it always a little intimidating for me to be up here with him, but
this guy.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Richard, for introducing us so kindly, and Cynthia for organizing. I think she stepped out, probably organizing the next event right now. Rick and I did this last year, an alumni event where we discussed, I think, the chaos in our national situation and trying to make sense of it archetypally.
The title was Gimme Shelter.
Yeah.
Weathering the storm in an archetypal cosmos.
Yeah. So we're still weathering it, but this time we're going to keep it a little bit closer to home and talk about CIIS as an institution and our own personal relationships to it, which is how we'll start, and then we'll each offer our sense, coming from different generations, of what the importance and the meaning of this institution is and where it's headed, hopefully in the next 50 years. So I guess I'll start and talk about my own journey to this place. I've been here for 10 years now, which is astonishing. I came in 2008 to the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program and entered the master's level program. And I knew I wanted to go to graduate school and study consciousness, study philosophy, study the big questions. I went to the University of Central Florida for my undergraduate degree, and I studied cognitive science there, which is about as close as you can get to studying consciousness. Though unfortunately for most cognitive scientists, consciousness is just a word we use to describe something that's ultimately a process inside of the skull that eventually will be describable in terms of neural firing and electrical and chemical activity. And that wasn't satisfying to me. That perspective seemed absurd. And I wanted to continue to study in an academic setting, but I found that most of the perspectives and the thinkers and philosophers that I was interested in, I had to study on my own outside of class. That was my experience as an undergraduate. So I was reading Alan Watts, who was one of the early professors at the institutional progenitor of CIIS. In the late 50s, I was studying Carl Jung. Jung was at least mentioned in one of my undergrad psychology classes, but only to be dismissed. I think they said something like, if you thought Freud was nuts, wait till you get a load of this guy. So I was seeking a graduate school, and I was reading a book by a cultural historian and philosopher named William Irwin Thompson called Coming into Being, and he had taught, I think he had a year-long appointment here in the mid-90s, and he taught a course on the evolution of consciousness, and he was talking about his experience in class with the students. They were studying Jean Gebser, this grand theorist of the evolution of consciousness, and also Ken Wilber. And Thompson's description of the students was that they're all very bright and fascinated in the material, but he was upset that they didn't prefer the kind of high European cultural outlook of someone like Gebser, and they preferred the more like renegade cowboy approach of Wilbur, and that they were also very interested in talking about all the new psychedelics that they were trying and working out the philosophical implications of their experiences. And I thought, wow, where was he teaching? So that's when I found out about CIIS. This was in probably 2007. And because San Francisco already was so expensive, I decided I should probably look for other alternatives, maybe something more practical. I considered being a counseling psychologist and applied to some counseling programs that were more local. I was in Florida at the time, right? But at the end of the day, I just felt this karmic pull, as many of us do who end up at this institute. And I applied, and the summer before I started, Robert McDermott called me for my interview, and you had a bad cold at the time. And it was hard. There was a lot of coughing, but I could tell I could tell that you were a deep thinker, and that you were asking me if I was really sure I wanted to come into this program. And I think your strategy is really wonderful, the way you approach prospective students, by making sure that we have no choice. We feel a sense of calling, that we have to be here. And I certainly felt that, more so after I spoke with you on the phone. And yeah, I didn't know a soul out here. I moved out, found an apartment, started class, and I'll go into a bit more about what my experience was at the school a bit later in my first impressions. But yeah, I did the master's program, then I entered the PhD program, and defended my dissertation 2 years ago. And sometime towards the end of my dissertation work, I started working as an administrator, and continue to do so now. I've really learned about, there are two cultures, the sciences and the humanities, but there are also another two cultures, administration and faculty. And I've been kind of straddling both of these worlds, and learning a lot about how, when I am a faculty member, I hope to be very supportive of administrators, because they work very hard, as do faculty, in different ways, right? So now I'm teaching as an adjunct in a new online program, which is something that CIIS has done for, I think, 20 years with one of our programs, Transformative Inquiry. And now many of our other programs are expanding online, and I think the future of higher education is something maybe we'll explore later. But clearly, the internet has something to do with that. So it's very exciting to see CIIS continuing to expand its programs into the virtual environment. So I've been here for 10 years. I live and breathe this place, and I feel very committed to its mission. And we'll explore more how that mission has evolved in a moment here. But I want to hear a bit about Rick's journey, who's been here for 25 years now, right?
That's correct. Exactly. This is my 25 years this year. I'll be brief. I want to go into the larger topic, but just by way of fast introduction, you used the word, felt very kind of karmically, the phrase karmically pulled, and I noticed that when Robert and Devashish had their event here 2 nights ago as part of the series, definitely the theme of what brought them to this institution was definitely karma. In fact, that was Robert's answer to Devashish's opening question: what brought you here? What brought you into encounter with Haridas Chowdhury and that little tradition? And he said, well, one word answers both of those, karma. And I thought about the extent to which everybody in the room undoubtedly had a pretty good idea what he meant, and how that wouldn't have necessarily been the case before 50 years ago in many audiences, where you would just say, it was karma. To that extent, that that assimilation of a perspective in which the idea of karma is the pervasiveness of that in our culture is a good index of the extent to which the East-West dialogue, of which the whole lineage of CIIS, its founding in '68 as CIAS, California Institute of Asian Studies, the Cultural Integration Fellowship before that, the American, excuse me, I just had a class for 3 hours before this class, so my voice is going to have to be modulated here. The American Academy of Asian Studies in the 1950s, and the East-West Renaissance, in a sense, that San Francisco was such an epicenter of. Its success in bringing into the world a perspective that has been carried so deeply by Asian traditions and has now entered into the common vocabulary of so many people is a testament to, in a way, the impulse that CIIS in particular has been carrying in our culture. And I was thinking about how karma, like we in the West, we might say something like, in an earlier era, you'd say, well, instead of the word karma, you might use the word something like providence, or it was God's will, or something like that was my calling, as in divine calling, that kind of thing. And just how karma brings in a whole nother dimension of, in a sense, it brings in more agency, even if that agency comes from other lifetimes, but while carrying the sense of a divine purpose being unfolded. And then I was thinking how in the West, where we had providence and God's will come in as so dominant for thousands of years, that location of agency in the transcendent Godhead with modernity got interjected into the human. And so agency is carried by the human being, and the divine to some extent, or to complete extent in many parts of the society, is eclipsed. And also agency was eclipsed in the rest of the natural environment too, and the natural world, and just carried by humans. So I don't know, just thinking about how that evolution of consciousness and the different cultural legacies that Asian and Western traditions have carried is embodied in when we would say a word like karma. Well, it certainly was karma that brought me here, as my feeling of it. But the background of it is I came here in 1993, and I two, the key conversation also was with Robert McDermott, who was already my friend then for over half a decade, because we met at the revisioning philosophy project that took place at Esalen Institute when he was a New York professor and chair of the philosophy program there in New York, City University of New York, and at Baruch, and I had been at Esalen for many years and working on my Passion of the Western Mind at that time when we met. But by 1990 he had become president, and then in 93 he asked if I could come up here and begin teaching. And but in other respects, I would say my engagement with CIIS, and maybe with its deeper meaning, its larger cultural mission, it goes back earlier than 25 years, in the sense that from the time I got to Esalen Institute in 1974, which is another decade, 20 years earlier than when I started teaching here, that was Esalen and CIIS are really sister communities, sister learning communities that were born out of the same matrix in which Haridas Chowdhury and Frederick Spiegelberg, Alan Watts were such key figures, and then Mike Murphy and Dick Price attending, being part of that in the 1950s, had the idea about Esalen, and then founded it in the early 60s. And then Esalen took the route of being, much more, it was sort of more the Dionysian, Big Sur, and highly focused on practices and transformation, personal transformation and cutting edge, but without any academic, almost an allergy to academic degrees or status. As a matter of fact, when I finished my doctorate, while I was at Esalen, I didn't speak about it to anybody because a PhD meant nothing, actually less than zero there. It wasn't something you wanted to speak about particularly. And honestly,
if you told them the title, LSD psychotherapy, or the topic at least, it might have been more interesting to them.
My dissertation was on LSD psychoanalysis and spiritual rebirth. It was focused on LSD therapy. Stan Groff was my chair of the committee. But so in some ways, I've been very much part of this larger world for going back to the early 70s, and in some sense even to the 60s, when people like exposure to Alan Watts, same with you, but in the late 60s, and Ram Dass had just come back from India back to Harvard, where I was an undergraduate in 68 and 69, and I was really sort of absorbing much of the same nectar that was being dispensed here in San Francisco and in Big Sur, even there in Cambridge. Maybe I'll just start a little bit with what I see as a kind of the trajectory or the arc of our topic tonight, and the evolution that of mission that has taken place at the center of CIIS over these 50 years. And I think the very first thing I am struck by when I think about that is, on the one hand, we can see a sharp difference. There was the focus was very kind of bicultural in a certain way in 1968. East-West, the dialogue between the engagement was very bicultural, and it was coming out of Louis Gainsborough's initial inspiration to open up Westerners to a more adequate appreciation and understanding of Asian cultures and religious traditions and perspectives, and then the ways in which Haridas Chowdhury embodied that, carrying Aurobindo's vision and his own highly individuated personality. People like Alan Watts bringing his brilliance and wit and spin on that encounter. Each of these are bringing a particular meaning to East, which I'll say a little bit more about in a second. But if the initial difference I see between 1968 and 2018 is a difference between East-West focused then as almost like that was like the entering wedge, opening up the Western sensibility here, located in the West Coast of San Francisco of United States, at this westernmost frontier of the kind of European expansion westward to the Pacific Ocean, and it, at the same time that it is that opening wedge, it opens up the Western sensibility to something beyond its insular confidence and even arrogance that it had the best, the only rational, the only reasonable, persuasive, modern, what's the right word I'm looking for, viable perspective, that suddenly this enormous source of spiritual and philosophical richness, and also practice, meditation and capacity, potential for transcendent experience and so forth, comes in, and that radically opens up the insularity of that kind of Western ego. But at the same time, when we look at now, it's moved from just east-west to like north-south, to the ecological, the voices of the many different cultures, as well as species, as well as forms of life. All these are at the table as well. Also, the much, it's a very, instead of bicultural, it's like multicultural, multi-perspectival, focus on social justice, on diversity, on eco-justice, on integral ecology, on ecofeminism, on women's spirituality, sacred cosmology, indigenous wisdom traditions, shamanic traditions, esoteric traditions, west, east. All these are being carried and are being voiced with great passion in our time. And they also have and there's a great deal of sense of embattlement against entrenched forces that represent, whether it's patriarchy, Eurocentrism, racism, ableism, the colorism, anthropocentrism, and so forth. So that's a shift, and yet at the same time we can see a continuity, because and here I want to bring up a point that and those of you who may not have been here for Robert and Debashish's dialogue, I recommend listening to their dialogue that is or will be available on the internet very soon, because the East that was part of the East-West dialogue that was here at the dawn of CIIS or CIAS in '68 was not just it was not only, as rich as that is, not only Buddhist, Taoist, Hindu religious traditions and philosophy. This was an East that was that came through Aurobindo, among others, and Aurobindo through Chowdhury. Aurobindo is somebody who had already been living an East-West dialogue inside himself. He had integrated a tremendous amount of Western philosophy, science. I mean, being in London University in the 19th century, he's taking in late 19th century. He's taking in the consequences of Darwin, of Hegel, evolutionary thinking, social justice, and so forth. Those aren't accidental. That wasn't like an accidental placement. He was perhaps karmically in the right place to be taking in. He was like a meeting point of these different traditions. So already the East-West dialogue that's taking place in San Francisco in 1968 is that East part of the dialogue has already been inflected in those very enriching ways, including the fact that Aurobindo was a social revolutionary before he became a mystic. And voila, I mean, here we have, I think, depending on which part of the university or CIIS that you're talking about or to, you will find as much commitment to mystical experience as to social justice and to defiance and impulse to radically transform the economic, social, political, ecological structures of our society, et cetera. And in a strange way, 1968, with Haridas Chowdhury and his vision, he's already laying the groundwork for a kind of there's a dynamism in his sense of what this dialogue can bring about, and he is committed to an evolution of consciousness, not simply a recovery of a lost wisdom tradition. He is recovering that, but he's also part of an evolution of consciousness. And in addition, I think something I'd like to hear Matt speak to is that element of Chowdhury's commitment to making this an accredited university and not simply an ashram. That's big. I'll come back to that later. I'll just say one last thing, and then I'd like to ask Matt to see some of the arc that he has noted over these last 50 years. Keeping in mind, in my case, I've been here for exactly half of CIIS's history. So I'm speaking from within my, very, to some limited by that, by that half that I'm not here, but to some extent in touch with it. Matt, coming with his 10 years here at a very deep level of immersion, and also with a generational freshness of perspective that, as I, being, 36 years older than you, would be not able to be able to articulate and see the way Matt can. And I'll just say one last thing about this trajectory. I started with the sense of the difference from 68 to 2018. Then I pointed out the fact that there was a kind of continuity from the richer potentiality that in the seed that Haridas initiated the institute with. And then the last thing I want to say is 2018 is remarkably like 1968. That is, the era that we are in, and this decade that we are in, is very much like the decade of the 1960s. Whether we're talking about the political and the activation of youth, the civil rights movement, and Black Lives Matter, feminism, and the Me Too movement, talking about mass revolutionary movements happening from the Middle East and in many parts of the world from the 60s and to now. many other, the acceleration of history that we all feel, the eruption of the shadow in so many ways. Just 1968 brought Richard Nixon. 2018 has Donald Trump. Just to keep in mind, at the same time that we have these highly committed countercultural institutions in these two places, they are taking place within a national political situation where at the top are not exactly the paragons of spiritual enlightenment. So I just wanted to point out that kind of interesting, the differences, the continuity, and the fact that we are in a kind of cycle. What's that Mark Twain thing about history, or at least it's attributed to him. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, and we do seem to have something of that kind of cyclical, but in a new way, in a kind of spiral moment from the developments of the 60s. But I'd like to hear you, Matt. You may have something that you want to start with right away, but I'd like to hear you speak a little bit about this sense of the commitment towards accreditation within the academic world here of CIIS, and at the same time the spiritual dimension being carried.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I certainly want to touch on that. I think I'm going to. I'll arrive there.
Good.
The countercultural movement in the 1960s became very important to me as around 17 or 18 when I started to read Alan Watts and the beats, the poets like Allen Ginsberg, and I was reading Jack Kerouac, and San Francisco was a mythical place to me before it was my home. And I was, at least in this incarnate form, I wouldn't be born for 18 more years in 1968. But the way that the 60s was mythologized it had a huge impact on me, and it's largely what both intimidated me about this place and eventually drew me here. It intimidated me in the sense that something that had been in the books I was reading, a mythic place, was somewhere that I could actually go and drop myself into and become part of what I had perceived for many, the 5 or 6 years that I had been reading this material to be a world of world historical importance. And 40 years later, when I got here in 2008, just as I was starting, that was when the financial crisis was really getting underway. And all of a sudden, old structures that seemed unquestionable were breaking down. George Bush had been president for 8 years. And it was in that context that I became, really fascinated by the 60s and motivated to try to, step into that sort of a countercultural attitude towards the dominant institutions of the time. And our program goes on retreat to Esalen, or used to every year. And when we went in, I guess, October of 2008, the stock market was still plummeting. Everyone was unsure whether or not the economy could be saved or not. And I was really starting to live into the idea that, man, things are going to get so bad back there that we're going to get stuck at Esalen for who knows how long and just have to live off the garden.
Wishful fantasy.
Yeah. But then, in November, Obama was elected, the first African American president, and to be part of the atmosphere of this city. I was at a bar on Market Street, a few blocks from here, with other PCC students, and we ran out into the street after he was announced as the winner, and we were hugging strangers, and people were just pulling over in their cars and getting out and hugging people, and there was such a sense of renewed possibility. And as as history will, it's often, there are these moments of breakthrough and then things settle down again and the old patterns come back. And, here we are 10 years later with Trump, and it feels like the stakes in the 60s were already so high. Politically, the significance of the damage that industrial civilization was doing to the biosphere was first dawning upon us. Nuclear war was at risk of breaking out at any moment, and here we are again. And in fact, the stakes are even higher now. The ecological situation in the late 60s was such that if we acted then with commitment at the level of like mobilizing the entire economy for World War II, if it was that level of commitment at that time, we probably could have avoided the worst. But at this point, I'm not sure we can avoid a continued degradation of our civilizational systems and institutions. But a place like CIIS and the commitment that Haridas Chaudhuri had to institutionalizing it and seeking accreditation, when many of the students, as I understand at the time, would have preferred it to remain more like an ashram, where the expectations, the pressure put onto a school as a result of needing to remain accredited so that we can get federal financial aid funding and prove that our graduates are getting jobs, and that certainly has shaped the way that the mission has developed. And the fact that our mission says that we're committed to serving individuals, communities, and the earth is, that's why I'm here. That's why I'm so committed to this place. And at a time when higher education as a whole is under such a threat, where it seems like half of the country, whereas the young kids in the 60s might have been suspicious of people with PhDs, now it's half the country, people who identify as more conservative, are pretty suspicious of universities because it seems like they tend to produce more liberal-minded, progressive-minded people.
Atheists.
Yeah, atheists. And with the Department of Education being run by the person it's being run by, and the threat of public education itself just being decimated, it's going to be challenging for any small school to survive in the next decades, the next couple years. But I think because of the unique mission of this place, that if we're not afraid to be, the countercultural school founded in coming out of the San Francisco Renaissance, with a non-denominational, pluralistic spiritual mission that's welcoming of all of these various ways of knowing that have been violently, in many cases, repressed by the rationalistic, scientistic epistemology that dominates most universities, that we're going to attract people who more and more are fed up with that model because it's caused so much suffering. I think of this place as a home for academic refugees who want to remain thinkers and scholars and contributors to the store of human knowledge and continue to push the envelope, but who just felt too alienated in a normal university setting. That was true for me as a student. That's what led me here. And I think whether we, as an institute, sink or swim in the future, as we move into the future, will have to do with whether or not we're embarrassed to be who we are, or whether or not we wear our idiosyncrasies and our uniqueness as a point of pride, and not try to pretend like we're just another university. We have to remain accredited. otherwise, it's that federal financial aid funding that's allowing people to come here. But we can't be afraid to be who we are, and I think there's a extent to which we, in order to preserve ourselves financially and to preserve accreditation, have maybe tried to be a little too normal and have lost sight of the uniqueness of our mission. And I think I really want to encourage us to stay true to that.
Yeah, I'm thinking how much what you're describing is a kind of tension of opposites that we have to be willing to carry, to use the Jungian imperative of always there's going to be opposing goods that we can feel in conflict about, that's part of the human condition. What did Jung say? He said, to live a life without conflict is to live a life in the beyond, which God intended only for angels. But God loves human beings more than angels. Yours sincerely, Carl Gustav Jung. It's a letter that he wrote. But his continuing message about the importance of carrying that tension of opposites, and in this particular issue that you're putting your finger on, Matt, is this idea of simultaneously, it's not only to be accredited to allow financial aid, for example, for our students. Obviously, it's so crucial, more crucial today than ever because of tuition expenses and expensive everything.
Living expenses, yeah.
Yeah, living expenses and so forth. But at the same time, I think accreditation symbolizes a commitment to a certain type of rigor, and at the same time, the commitment to remain faithful to the inspiring ideals that make us a distinctive learning community, that is carrying an appreciation of the spiritual dimension of life into all realms of academic discourse, of intellectual engagement, whether it's anthropology or psychology or history or philosophy or ecology, that denying or bracketing out the spiritual is not just doesn't serve intellectual rigor, but actually is a devaluation of that rigor. It distorts it. You cannot understand the evolution of philosophy if you don't bring in spirituality and religion.
Mm-hmm.
You can't understand the history of the human relationship to the earth if you don't bring in spiritual understandings of the evolving spiritual and religious traditions.
Yeah, and another one of these tensions is that, of course, in our secular age, the university has become a place where the purpose of an education is to help train you for a job, and we all need to make a living, and so students who take out loans or who pay out of pocket for a degree are rightly expecting that this is going to help advance their career in some way. So I don't want to downplay that. That's an important side of the tension. But the other side of it, which, reading Chowdhury's philosophy of education, his understanding of what education is really about at a deeper spiritual level, it's about the human being coming to discover their alignment with being, right? It's the human being trying to come into an integral relationship with the universe. The university is about studying our place in the universe in the broadest sense. And, when I look around at other universities, that's not talked about. Education is just training for the next generation of workers. And we're at a point in our civilization where business as usual, everybody seems to recognize that business as usual cannot continue. So to just keep training people for the jobs that already exist is suicidal at this point. And it doesn't seem like we're going to get any help from the top down, from governments or even the big universities that are going to shift this. It's going to have to bubble up, and an institute, a small school like this, I think can be a beacon to show that actually, yeah, there's the need to make a living, but there's also the need to learn how to be a human being and to learn how to contribute to the evolution of consciousness and to carry on this adventure of human meaning making that our species has been on for a few 100,000 years.
I think I want to just slightly qualify one point you're making about the state of the mainstream universities, because I think after all, both you and I, and probably most of the people in this room, were formed by those universities, and we didn't. I think there's the classic liberal education was one that did it. Liberal was to free the mind, and it was to. I think there is room in many universities for more than just training for a job. You may have to kind of weave your way through to the right program. Maybe the English department that might carry it better than the philosophy department at a particular university. But while the mainstream universities have their flaws, I think there's still a lot that is valuable and noble that's taking place in them, but I think that what CIIS is bringing, and this is very much in agreement with the point you're making. I think it was one of the presidents of IONS, of the Institute of Noetic Sciences years ago. It might have been Wink Franklin. Anyway, he talked about the idea of the fertile crescent. He drew two circles, and then but the circles overlapped, and there's a crescent that is formed by those two circles at the overlapping point. And if you were to take the let's call it mainstream culture, represented by mainstream universities, the traditional rigorous education there, and the mainstream society generally is one circle. And then there's the counterculture here, that in all its various forms. And then you've got that crescent in the center, and that is a fertile crescent. And because there's something about where those two interact that allows for, and it's often at the outskirts of a culture. It's often the small renegade institution, the academy that's not a mainstream university. Even we've talked about it before. The Ficino's Academy in Italy, in Florence, was not an accredited university. It was a group of scholars and aspiring philosophers, intellectuals, artists that wanted to study all the different cultures that were available to them, and were translating things from other cultures. It was very much kind of like the aspirations that we have here. They were not part of the mainstream medieval universities that were carrying the larger culture. But the winds of change that brought about the new civilization very much went through that academy. The Copernican Revolution was affected by it. The High Renaissance, the humanity. Michelangelo was educated by Ficino in many ways, and his group Pico. So when Gregory Bateson, who was kind of a background figure, father figure for, or grandfather figure for both Esalen and the CIIS community in certain ways. He, one time when he was living at Esalen near the end of his life, I asked him to, we were having a little Tuesday night club once every week where a group of us who were kind of interested in intellectual matters would get together and discuss a topic led by one of us. And I asked Gregory to start the first one. And he said, sure. And he said, I'll make the title of it Rigor and Imagination. And that's always stuck with me. I mean, that was like 1978 or so. And it's always stuck with me because in some ways that's exactly what we're about. If you're all rigor, you'll be stuck inside a paradigm. You'll be very disciplined and organized and hardworking. But if you don't have the imagination, you're in a trap. Well, if you're all imagination and no rigor, then you have another problem. And so there's something about rigor and imagination, like the disciplined imagination, the imagination that has integrated its tradition, yet stays true to the innovative impulse, the creative impulse that's coming through us. That seems to me the point of the Fertile Crescent, that CIIS is singularly capable of carrying, and has been, I think, to a great extent, successfully carrying in the world very, very, very nobly. And I think this is that tension of opposites that we're trying to hold here, and not get too far on the side of meeting accreditation standards but losing our soul, or staying true to our soul but getting knocked out of the the viable academic, economic realities of our time.
Yeah, I love the university as an institution, and I am hopeful that it is able to rediscover itself. I think Harvard is very different from the University of Central Florida.
Mm-hmm.
The philosophy department at Harvard is at no risk of closing, even if their enrollment goes down. Whereas, the university system in Wisconsin is going to close many humanities departments because why fund it if it's not producing well-trained employees? And at UCF, which is true of many research universities, we were in the middle of a research park that was full of defense contractors, so Lockheed Martin and Radon and Northrop Grumman, and the engineering department and the computer science department at UCF had these grand glass buildings, beautiful architecture, and the philosophy department had a building that was from the 60s and run down, and seeing the way that the faculty in the humanities departments versus the sciences just hated each other. This was not a university community.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I certainly appreciate what I learned and the rigor that I got. I got my rigor at UCF, and I got rigor here too, but my imagination was atrophying if it weren't for the stuff I was reading on the side outside
Mm-hmm.
of class.
Did you have a teacher, though, that kind of suggested you might want to read this or that?
So, cognitive science is generally oriented towards artificial intelligence. Sure. And what's called the computational paradigm, that the brain is the hardware and the mind is the software. And I had one professor named Mason Cash, and another actually named Sean Gallagher, who introduced me to continental philosophy and phenomenology, which is a completely different orientation, which takes human experience as primary. And what the sciences do is objectify and abstract out of that primary field of human experience, and then forgets that it's done that and treats those abstractions as what's really real, and tries to explain consciousness based on the abstractions. And phenomenology calls all that out.
Right.
And I was very grateful that I was exposed to that perspective, so at least I saw the sort of escape route out of the
Mm-hmm.
mainstream paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Could you say something, Matt, about, from your perspective, because you're so, you're very active in like the Bernie Sanders movement, and you are so in touch with, you as you develop your own curriculum for your different courses, you you're very in touch with giving a diversity of voices to your reading list, and I think of you as being quite conscious of like intersectionality and so forth. I wonder if you could say something, since you also are familiar with the history and some of the early literature about the founding of CIIS, Harriet S. Chowdhury's work, things that you've read about the life of the Institute at that time. What do you see in terms of the evolution of either the continuity or the breaks or the transformation of that mission of the school 50 years ago compared with now? And because you're also very in touch with the student body, with the staff and the faculty. I mean, you're in an unusually like a trivalent position to be able to relate to all three parts of the CIIS community.
I think the cultural movement in the 60s and that this school was born out of was very, my perception of it at least, is that it was very idealistic about bringing about a certain kind of change, and that the sort of hippie, psychedelic, flower child orientation with some Eastern mysticism sprinkled in, and rediscovery of some of the Native American forms of spirituality, and that this was all part of a sort of medicinal brew that was going to heal the culture. And I think what happened is that the 60s countercultural energy was kind of swallowed by consumer capitalism, and it became cool to wear tie-dye, and the music became very cool for everyone, and the attitude was like, an example of this would be that you could, I remember going into a shopping mall, which I haven't been to in a while. It's like the church of modern consumerism, and you'll see like in these more kind of countercultural stores, there'll be like a Che Guevara t-shirt that you could buy for $30. And there's a famous Coca-Cola advertisement I think in 1970 it came out. This is thematized in Mad Men, if you guys have seen this series on Netflix, where it's people from all over the world, all different races and cultures, singing together about how happy Coca-Cola makes them. And the idea was that the globalization of our economy was it became the way that was communicated, and the way that the media portrayed that was that we're all going to live together as one big happy family, drinking Coke together, and it didn't really play out that way. And I think when I was a teenager and in my young 20s, I shared the idealism that I think young people in the 60s had. As I began to get more into politics and understand history more, I became a little bit more realistic, I guess. And I think CIIS today needs to not be as naive about how quickly transformation can happen, at the same time that it's protecting something so important, which is what Haridas Chowdhury recognized, is even if we do bring about the political changes and the economic changes that are necessary, if human hearts don't change, if a rebirth at the level of our spiritual orientation doesn't occur, then those new systems will become just as corrupt. So again, it's these tensions, the tension of opposites that needs to be held. And so I think CIIS today, we've got such a diversity of programs. An anthropology program that practices a form of, and teaches a form of activist ethnography, And we've got PCC that's trying to reimagine the human species and think on the level of worldviews
and cosmology
and cosmology. We've got all these therapy programs who are really doing important work in the trenches, trying to heal people in a very sick society, and
treat and in interaction with diverse populations and with a perspective that we need to learn from and not just be the healing physician from those cultures.
Right. Yeah, a relational form of healing. So I think the psychology school has grown. The School of Professional Psychology has grown tremendously and is very well regarded in the state in terms of the number of licensed therapists that are coming out of this school. And so CIIS is making a tremendous contribution on that front in a very practical way. Not just that our students are getting employment, but that people are being served in our community who are in need. And I think the humanities side of CIIS, the School of Consciousness and Transformation, is a place where we can study ideas and in a way that is not just intellectual but transformative of who we are as people, where all of our person is welcome in the classroom, where we can speak from personal experience, and that's honored as a source of wisdom. I sat in at a class in UC Berkeley a couple weeks ago, a graduate class in the philosophy department, and I haven't been outside of CIIS for so long. I was struck by the differences in how students in a graduate school like Berkeley interact with each other in the classroom. And in the Q&A period after the lecture, it was so competitive. Every student was trying to show off their knowledge, the books that they've read. So before they'd even asked their question, they were talking about all the books that they've read and nuancing their position, and then finally they'd get to the question. And it was mostly men who spoke, and the women in the classroom, the instructor luckily made sure to call on those who hadn't spoken yet. But it was just such an antagonistic, competitive environment. And the thought that someone might bring up their personal experience, everyone would probably look at them and think that they needed to go see the psychiatrist, the school psychiatrist, as soon as possible. So I was immediately brought back to my experience at UCF, the alienation. And I didn't do graduate school, I just did undergrad, but I can see how competitive that environment is, and we don't have that here. It's such a collegial environment, it's community. And the more we're able to share who we are with the world, the more students seeking a new way will be drawn to us.
I think that brings up a point that I have intended to speak about this evening, and maybe I'll say this, and then maybe we could open it up to people's contributions and questions, comments, and so forth. But it's the idea of, well, first of all, that idealism you were talking about, and perhaps in some ways a naive idealism. I don't know how. I don't know if we would characterize Haridas Chowdhury as having that, but perhaps if you think about the fact that we just celebrated the Summer of Love, 1967, last summer here, the 50th anniversary of it, and we had an event here where talking about that, honoring that anniversary, and I mentioned that we, summer of 1967, here in San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury, 9 months later, CIIS is founded, and there's a kind of so we're in some sense conceived and then born out of that historical and cultural and even spiritual moment, and we carry that. And when I first started teaching here, when Robert was initially president, back in the early 90s, we were all located in the Haight-Ashbury, right on Ashbury Street. A lot of you remember that very well. And at the lovely Catholic grade school there that we fully populated, right across the street from the Grateful Dead house, or very nearby. And but over the years, I think what we can see here has evolved is something that I've called like a heroic community. And I'm using that word heroic in quotes, meaning the heroic is what is the individual as like a prophet, like Martin Luther King or Ezekiel, Isaiah, or a philosopher like Socrates, or an ecologist journalist like Rachel Carson, or who holds a vision of the good, has a loyalty to a frame of work of values that is sharply distinct from that carried by the mainstream culture, and it takes a kind of heroic stance to be able to hold that vision of the good against the, let's say, consumerist capitalism or materialistic worldviews in a more philosophical sense, and so forth. And of course, now we're in a time when we all recognize individuals can't do the job that's necessary. We need communities to do that, and we need heroic communities. And I think I think CIIS is one of those heroic communities that is carrying that vision of the good and that framework of that frame of reference that has a set of higher values that shapes its aspirations, its actions, and even the structure of its community. And so, and I see CIIS as one. There are places like Oroville or Damanhur in Italy, Oroville in India, Findhorn in Scotland, Schumacher College in England, Omega, Esalen, Ions, the Waldorf schools, and anthroposophical societies, Jungian institutes and associations around the country, of which there are so many and so vital. It's remarkable. There are many of these, and the NGOs and et cetera. There are many of these heroic communities. I remember that Paul Hawken gave a talk at a Bioneers is another one, at a Bioneers conference, in which, as he was speaking of all the different institutions and non-government organizations around the world that were committed to, eco-justice, social justice, human rights, etc. And as he was speaking, one name after another of these different institutions around the world and organizations was going by on a screen. And during the entire talk that he was speaking, it kept going. And then he said at a certain point, this will go on, this is like on Friday, this will continue all the way through the rest of the weekend. I mean, that's how many around the world that are carrying this. So there's a lot of, that's where hope lies, I think. And I believe that the challenge of a heroic community is simultaneously to hold space for many individuals within it, to individuate, to go through the deep inner transformation that is necessary to come into contact with the deeper sources of meaning and purpose in our lives that transcend our own individual achievement and ego success or and so forth, but are in touch with the archetypal sources of purpose and meaning that are of get us in touch with the deeper principles of life and death, often through an encounter with a death rebirth quality, the perinatal, the individuation process in Jung's sense, the dark night of the soul, as St. John of the Cross would call it, the hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell would call it. We each have to do something like that individually, but we can't do it on our own. We need the emotional and, in some sense, the philosophical support of a community to hold us in relationship as we're going through these powerful transformations, to be able to be initiated into a kind of sacralized vision that allows us to go forward. The civil rights movement, when Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and the others were carrying it for, they were working out of the churches. They sang songs every night, taking up as much of their time of planning for their next march and so forth. They sang spirituals and songs of hope that were absolutely as important to them as the political organizing and planning that they were doing. So I sense that. I've experienced it in our PCC community for sure, and it exists in a wider way throughout the CIIS. On the one hand, we are a matrix of overlapping, but in some sense coherent perspectives that are envisioning a better world that is spiritually informed, that reconnects with the ensouled cosmos, that honors the great diversity of humanity and all the different modes of being on this earth. But at the same time, we need sufficient coherence as a community to be able to serve as a light for the whole, for the larger community that we're embedded in, our society, our global society, but at the same time to be porous to it, not so insular that we become a cult, which is always the danger of a heroic community, is to become a cult and to be only understand its own vocabulary, and often the cult becomes rather totalitarian in terms of its internal make structure as well, and doesn't support individuation. So I think of it as simultaneously we need to be a kind of, if the solar is like the individual single light that shines powerfully and you can't see anything else when the sun is out, if the lunar, the ruler of the night, is also that which allows the vision of the many stars at night, and of the whole, the deep space. In some sense, we need to be both a solar community of the hero is a solar hero, but we need to have a lunar openness to the multiple voices, both within ourselves and outside, and that's to keep that dialectic between the solar and lunar, both internally and in relationship to the larger society, is the challenge. But I think that CIIS's greatness and something close to the core of its mission, I was struck by a sentence that I came upon in Haridas Chaudhuri, The Synergic Universe, where he said, "In our present age, we need a worldview which takes into account the fundamental requirements of the age, as well as the basic aspirations of the evolving human psyche. We need a worldview which shows how our deepest aspirations are related to the essential structure of the universe." Now, this is very different from what you were saying, the university education that you were describing, and kind of feeling claustrophobic within, where everything's objectified and materialistic, and I hear he's calling for finding our way to a worldview in which the universe itself is seen as being in continuity with our own deepest spiritual and moral aspirations. The only way we can get to such a worldview is by going through deep transformations that involves a kind of initiatory process. And if we think of CIIS as being partly an educational institution and partly a matrix of initiations for people to go through, that seems to me an essential requirement of our being as a heroic community to be effective in the world. So, anyway, Matt, do you have anything else you want to add before we?
I'd love to hear if anyone has questions or comments. And
yeah.
Yeah.
I know there's people here who precede us, like Ann Tyke here was here before I ever got here, and of course Robert, and anybody else that would like to say anything, please do. We've got a microphone.
This microphone's still on? How we can do two mics? That's as far as it will go, so you have to come forward. There we go. All right? I think it's on.
It's on.
Yeah, it's on. I almost brought this up on Monday, but it comes up again as you're finishing the round here of talking. And I was thinking about Chaudhry and the self-integration part, and it always seemed to be similar to what I found when I was working with the psychedelic research too, the three themes of the personal, the transpersonal, and the interpersonal. And I was thinking also about the Jungian part of this, bringing it into the collective, and I thought there was a lot of talk when Jung left off about the collective unconscious, and you didn't hear much about what the collective conscious may look like. And I think that enough people in the last 50 years have been doing their own personal work, and it might be time, like you're saying, for people to sit down together to unpack that collective unconscious and make it conscious, because it's definitely on the stage now for us to look at with the shadow aspect of it. So I think that Jung had one more thing to do to make the collective unconscious conscious, but he had to work through the personal stuff first. I think he needed to put that in place. So I think that the project has something to do with that, beyond the heroic. I remember Stan Krippner saying that we need collective heroics now, because it's, and Jung talked about the hero and initiate. There's one big difference. The hero goes for it, and with his hubris, and he gets his head chopped off in the first battle. And the initiate sticks around and learns and tempers his ego, tempers his wisdom, and is there to pass on a tradition to the next generation. So he has a longevity. So I think we're moving from that heroic to the initiate, and from the collective unconscious becoming conscious, if we're going to be able to keep the balance of the planet. So I think that it is a project that now is time. So I thank you for reiterating kind of what was you picked up in an interesting way from Monday and rewove it in a beautiful way. So thanks.
The only thing I'd like to maybe add by way of comment is, like, I think the heroic that goes for it and then just either gets his head chopped off or brilliantly succeeds by getting 5 touchdowns on Sunday or something like that. That form of the hero is an earlier, like a kind of immature form of the hero. I think we all have a sense for what the true heroic is about, like the person who we read about a while ago, where he was with his 2 little daughters in the New York subway, and a person near them who he didn't know had a seizure and fell off into the subway rails, and the man could see that there was that the subway train was starting to come, and this guy was flailing around with a seizure, down on the ground there between the rails, and was obviously a horrible thing was about to happen. And without any hesitation, he let go of his daughter's hands and leapt down below and fought with pushed the man who was having the seizures down below the rails as far as he could go, and then went down as far as he himself could go, and the train is screeching, brakes, and right as it stops, he calls out and says, "Tell my daughters that we're okay down here." That they had just, he felt it very close, but I mean, we all have the sense like that's true heroism. And yet, in other words, it's there is a self-submission on behalf of a larger good that takes whatever the situation, which may take 60 years to work on, or it might be an immediate task that has to be done in the moment, but where there is some sublation of the individual on behalf of the whole. And at the same time, that fulfills the individual in the very moment of the service to the whole. I think that would be the larger meaning of the heroic that I would have in mind, and the initiate and the hero archetype overlap at that point. But I know what you mean about that's why the hero has been rightly condemned if you're just thinking about whatever the lone cowboy, etc. But there's more to the hero than that. I would argue. Thanks, Howie. Please.
Rick, this is a question about the second C in PCC. And let me set up the question this way. Last night I was in a class with Debashish Banerjee, and we were talking about Sri Aurobindo, and there were certain notes that Sri Aurobindo had written, and Sri Aurobindo talked about a mystical experience he had in 1908 when he was in the Alipore jail, when he had a vision or apparition of Vivekananda, in which Vivekananda showed him all of the various levels and stages of consciousness, all the way up to the overmind or the supramental. So I asked Devashish whether or not these kind of ideas and concepts of Sri Aurobindo about consciousness were part of your conception when you put together PCC. So I'd like to ask you about that, and equally importantly, when you reflect back on yourself 25 years ago, thinking about consciousness as you put it into PCC, is it different now, or is it expanded now compared to how you were thinking about it 25 years ago?
Well, let's see. Of course, so the second C you were talking about was consciousness, right? Okay, so Aurobindo was definitely in the background. First of all, Robert was an important part of the conversations that went into the forming of PCC. He undoubtedly was thinking about where he wanted to come in to start teaching after he became president emeritus, and so the evolution of consciousness was an important part of the PCC mission, and the major visionaries of the evolution of consciousness that shaped and inspired PCC had Aurobindo, Teilhard, Whitehead, Gebser, Jung. These were all major players in the no one captured the flag, to use the phrase that they used to say at Esalen. No one could capture the flag that was committed to a pluralism, and we too have been very much committed to a pluralism in that sense. But definitely, Aurobindo's vision of a higher potentiality that, in some sense, contemporary humanity is pregnant with, is close to the heart of the PCC aspiration. as to my own sense of how my own sense of consciousness has evolved in 25, it certainly has evolved in 25 years, and I suppose where my mind was a little bit more in 93 would be reflected more in like the epilogue I wrote to the end of Passion of the Western Mind. That was about as far as I had gotten at that point. And one of the nice things about being a teacher is that you get to, Heidegger said that the teacher is the person in the classroom who's probably learning the most. And there's something about, not only having one's thoughts reflected back and in dialogue and learning from others, there's something also about even just speaking it in a living community where one is constantly being kind of informed by, enriched by. The I-thou dialogue is happening every moment within the as tonight. Matt and I have said a bunch of things here, but I'm absolutely certain that everything we said was partly shaped by everybody that's in this room, coming into our consciousness and in subtle ways, images, ideas that we suddenly think this would be the right word to use or the right direction to take, is very easily coming from the morphic field that we are all embedded in here together tonight in this room. And so 25 years of that kind of being, that kind of immersion has definitely had its influence. I think definitely, although I came in with a certain sense of like the divine feminine, certainly feminist commitments and so forth, that's been radically deepened and expanded over these 25 years. So also my greater appreciation of things like intersectionality and post-colonial factors in our history. I have come to a deeper appreciation of the dying that I think we as a civilization not only are undergoing, but in some sense have to go through. The question is in what sense we have to go through it, but some kind of a dying to our old identity, deconstructing of our old identity as human beings in relationship to the rest of the world, but also as particular kinds of human beings to other forms of kinds of ways of being human. That I've got a greater sense of how important that hard work is, and perhaps a certain defeat that has to happen in order for a higher good to unfold. I've been deeply influenced in my understanding of consciousness by teaching over these years with people like Brian Swim and his sense of cosmogenesis, of the cosmos evolving with a kind of numinous subjectivity that it is carrying and expressing through each of us, and that I am, and each of us is part of a long evolutionary biological and earth evolution, not just a kind of spiritual consciousness evolution, but that those two are I've come to really regard that integration of biological, geological, cosmological evolution with the evolution of consciousness as being kind of a cutting edge that I've been devoted to understanding better within our PCC program. Brian and I co-teach a class called Radical Mythospeculation, where we kind of address that frontier. Radical mythospeculation. Mythospeculation is a technical term that Eric Vogelin, the historian and philosopher, coined to describe in the archaic ages, a certain kind of living and working within a mythic perspective, but a higher degree of critical reflexivity was developing to the point where, while staying within the mythic, there were multiple forms of the myth being imagined and critiqued, and so you'd get something like, a good example would be the tragedy, the great tragedians in Greece. When you read Homer, you get, or Hesiod, you get one, a view of the mythology, but when you get the tragedians coming in the 5th century BCE, like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, they're taking those myths and they're probing them and they're questioning them and they're feeling the suffering of the human and the relationship of the suffering and the hubris of the human, but they're kind of it's a kind of mytho-speculation that is setting the stage for a major leap in consciousness. The Hebrew prophets were doing a mytho-speculation with new understandings of deity emerging, moving from the earlier forms of Yahweh, for example, to very different disclosures of that deity in the course of the biblical history. So, radical mytho-speculation. And then finally, being co-teaching with, or being part of the teaching here with people like Charlene Spretnak and a number of the women, including somebody like Catherine Keller, who we've been in relationship with outside of CIIS, but as a major voice and visionary and rigorous thinker. They have all really kind of helped transform my understanding of consciousness in a way that over these 25 years. I mean, just being in, if you stay in a vital community like this year after year, you can't help but just constantly be having your thought. I mean, hanging out with this guy here, really, I mean, if I could just take all the courses that I expect Matt will be teaching in the course of his life, I'll be a lot smarter person. So anyway, those are a few thoughts. Yeah. Please, is there anybody else that would like to? Anne, do you have any, or Ricky?
Thank you, Rick and Matt. I was thinking many of the same thoughts that you were articulating about the tensions that exist in the academy. Instead of rigor and imagination, I always experience it as containment and imagination, that the administration works diligently day and night to contain all the forces, and the faculty are,
unleashing them.
Yeah.
The faculty are unleashing them.
Yeah, and the faculty are unleashing them. So, and we don't, what box? And so this is, it's a kind of a dialectic forces that exist in the world and in the mind. But I really think the university exists specifically for certain people because that's who they are. And if they didn't have the university, they wouldn't know they couldn't have a life really, because they need that container in order to break free of it. And so it's just that paradox that I learned to kind of live with. And I really feel that there's certain forces within the human that we can't measure and we can't really explain. And you see it because everybody here speaks about being called to CIIS. So what is that calling? It's something that you can't really put your finger on necessarily. It's something that you feel before you find CIIS, and you want to find a place like CIIS, and then a lot of the fortunate people do. So my hope is that the faculty will keep the call going out, keep the beams going out so people can find CIIS.
And also that the administration will keep anchoring us,
Well,
containing.
Gotta do that. I sit next to Matt, and he doesn't know I'm keeping my eye on him.
I feel that, I feel that.
Okay, it's good he's experiencing that right now. And then I think, oh, the sighing has started. But he's really getting a well-rounded experience. And,
Yeah.
we're trying to launch him eventually down to your corner, so not too soon. But I was going to ask,
But
do
not
you
too
feel a
late.
sense of urgency when you look at what's happening in the world, and that sense of urgency somehow translates into your thought and work?
I certainly feel that, and it's things have spiraled so far out of control at this point that it's almost it's easy to check out and just say, like, okay, I need to focus on what's right in front of me and the people I love and the work I'm committed to, instead of trying to sort through the world's problems. And yet, I think with social media, it gives us all an outlet to kind of yell at the world and, you know, offer our solution to fix everything. And so, and just with the internet and the constant bombardment of news all the time, I can't help but be aware of what's happening minute by minute in the news cycle now. It's like, what's the next crazy thing that the president's going to do? And it's overwhelming. So my challenge, I think a lot of people's challenge, is to not numb out and to remain focused on whatever our personal mission in life is and what the mission of the communities that we belong to is, and just stay the course. The rapidity of change and crisis is, I think, a bit of a distraction from our commitments to do the work in the world that each of us is called to do as part of the communities that we're a part of. And it's a struggle for me, but I try to stay focused on those commitments despite the chaos, because I hope that the commitments I've chosen will be of service. If not tomorrow, then maybe the day after. But education for me is the long game. I decided as a high school student that I wanted to teach for a living, and I'm one of those people that, as much as I struggled with aspects of the university as an undergraduate, I also loved it. And I want to become a professor because I don't want to stop learning. And once you've reached that terminal degree, it's like, well, you keep learning by becoming a teacher. And so education, I think, is the greatest hope for our species. Every day a new child is born, right? And generation after generation, we're able to raise young people to inhabit the world in a completely different way if we choose to. So, when we get our act together as adults and commit as a heroic community or heroic society, maybe even at the level of our species, to honoring the wisdom that children come into the world with and cultivating that within a generation, just like that, we could be living in a completely different world because our values have shifted so quickly.
And what tends to bring about change at that level of at that speed and that depth tends to be a near-death experience of some sort. Like
Right.
that's the fastest mode of producing a transfiguration of moral values in your life, is to suddenly see that you might die or that you are going to die, if you're convinced that this is about to happen, nothing changes like that. And I think in some sense, that feeling of urgency that does pervade our time, it is accelerating, and the more conscious we are of the state of the planet, the more aware we are of the urgency and the emergency. And I think that the more that we can, it's in some ways that's a very familiar, excuse me, I just need to have a little water. I think that state where everything is getting faster and faster and you can hardly keep it, it's a kind of chaotic overwhelm, and it's a very familiar state for people who have done journeys inward where they are either like reliving their birth or facing something in the what's called the perinatal, as Stan Grof calls it. There's a very powerful acceleration of experience and the sense everything's about to explode, to collapse, and then it suddenly bursts into another mode of being entirely, where everything, a stillness comes in, a whole different sense of time, etc. A reconnection with the whole. And I feel like the whole world is sort of hurtling in a direction, something like that, and we're kind of being carried along with it. And that's kind of why I've been saying that it's important for, like what Matt was saying, you can numb out, because it takes a lot of courage to keep your hearts and minds and eyes open with what's happening in the world. It takes a kind of fortitude to really take that in and not get overwhelmed by it. And I think the key to our neither taking the numbing out route, the denial, just I'm just going to watch television or take ecstasy for the rest of my life or whatever, or on the other hand, go crazy by from the overwhelm, the grieving, etc., is to have enough continuing contact with a place that is not in a state of emergency, that is not hyper accelerated. And that can come in a number of ways. Some people meditate, some people pray, some people swim, some people, for me it especially comes in a kind of highly focused thinking and reading and writing in a kind of movement like that, where I'll be reading, I'll be writing, I'll be thinking, contemplating, usually not with the internet. It's got that, it's like having the screen there, the electronic screen, is a kind of throws it off somehow. It's often, it usually has to be a real book if I am engaging with that, and paper and pen, and there's something about that time. I can go into a fairly timeless place that way, and kind of move out of the archetypal realm of highly accelerated nihilistic explosion kind of, and move into this other place, and then re-engage that other place that is historically enveloping us with a greater sense of centeredness and maybe even a kind of faith that, and state of faith and hope that actually can help certainly me in difficult places, but maybe sometimes others too. See, I think we need a lot of people to be serving as kind of stabilizing agents of hope and peace in the midst of the turmoil. And so it takes some kind of practices like that keep us in touch with that part of experience that isn't completely caught up in the most recent push of news onto the iPhone of what you can't believe Trump has just done or whatever, and to take on, to be able to enter into that world with a centered equilibrium. Ricky?
I think everyone in the room would agree that technology has evolved at a pace much faster than ethics or consciousness. And, you look at reproductive technology and the, biologic, medical spheres, gene therapy, GMO food issues, reframing of terminal illness and death as something that's run amok. It was medicalized. It needs to. So all these things, to me, here physically CIIS sits. Is it a sense that it's indeed part of our karma, that CIIS is here, almost equidistant between Genentech and UCSF's new campus and a lot of these tech companies?
Yeah, Silicon Valley and so forth. Yeah, the computer revolution happened just minutes away in a garage. Yeah. Would you like to speak to that? I know you've thought a lot about it.
Yeah, when I got here in 2008, there was an empty lot across Mission Street and another empty lot on the other corner, and then next to us back here, this is the last empty lot that's going up as a condo. San Francisco was always known as a tech city, but now it's 2.0. And we're situated right at the center of it and trying still to figure out how to plug in.
Do you think that's a general sense with the faculty, outward looking?
I don't know. I'm not in a position to speak for all the faculty, and I don't fully know. We're a small enough place, but I don't know what all 70 of the core faculty are doing in that way. I think, as you mentioned, that technology has advanced way more rapidly than our ethical comprehension of some of the consequences of that technological evolution. And I think one of the things that we need to be careful of is both not to be Luddites, but to also, to the extent that we do want to partner with and work with some of these tech companies, that we aren't afraid to be critical of the cultural changes and if not evolution, maybe devolution of consciousness that some of these technologies bring about. I think there is a constructive dialogue to be had between CIIS and the forms of knowledge that we produce and study here, and the kinds of technologies that are being developed. When I think about consciousness and technology, I don't know that technology has run ahead of consciousness. I see in the history of our species a co-evolution, a constant, closely coupled evolution of consciousness and technology. Fire is the
Prometheus is fire.
It's the archetypal technology, right? And when our species, or probably Homo erectus, prior to Homo sapiens, first harnessed fire, it was a gradual process, right? And that's what allowed our jaw muscles to shrink, which gave room for our brain to expand, because we could cook our food, right? And so already with this first primordial form of technology, our very physiology is being changed, right? And we haven't yet implanted computers in our brains, but becoming literate, alphabetic, this transformed consciousness at a deep level. The printing press, with the political revolutions that were unleashed. So without Twitter, I don't think Trump is the president right now, right? So there's a co-evolution, or Facebook, but in terms of him having a mouthpiece, he can tweet and it's on the news in 5 minutes, He doesn't need to be invited in for an interview or anything. So the destiny of human beings and our technologies, it's I don't know where the human and the technology, where the human ends and the technology begins, right? So it doesn't make sense to say, to take a perspective of, whoa, this is too much, let's go back to just being human again. I think it's too late for that, right? We're already, in a sense, cyborgs. And which is not to say that we should just, continue down this path of, transhumanism without questioning from the perspective of deep philosophical lineages and spiritual lineages that human beings can draw upon. We do need to be more critical.
Stanford University has an honors major in ethics and tech.
Uh-huh.
And, I've just spent time looking at their curriculum, kind of with the view, if I were many years younger, going for an undergraduate degree, that would really attract me, actually.
Right.
But at least looking at the curriculum, there's nothing that looks like it, begs at epistemology or spiritual connections, roots, rituals.
Right.
At least, again, I haven't taken a class yet.
Yeah.
But I look at these other universities that are somewhat our competitors. They steal a lot of curricular coursework from us gradually. But to me, that's something that I think is part of our destiny, especially because we are right here.
Right.
So I just wondered if that was sort of a bubbling up outward gaze, like in the lunchroom or at faculty conferences and discussions.
Yeah.
Not that we're ever going to be Luddites. I think the most advanced would be for and we of course talk about this with students now and then, but for our imaginations to embrace and understand more about tech, not push it away and say it's bad.
Right.
But to be conversant with it so that we can become leaders in that.
Yeah.
To me, that's, I think, what would Haridas say if he were here?
Yeah.
And he'd say, learn about that. Don't be afraid of it. It's here to stay, and we want to offer wisdom, and the only way we can do that.
Well, and now because of because of the technology revolution that's happened within with the high-tech world here in the Bay Area, it's become too expensive for many people to move here to take courses to be local students, residential students, and therefore we're having to use a form of technology, online education, to be able to teach to distant students so they don't have to move to the unlivably expensive Bay Area. So it's a complex relationship, right? In that sense, where Matt is an expert of using the online medium to not only to conduct dialogues with people all around the world with his philosophy blog, but also to teach, online, which takes a kind of talent. The other thing that I'm thinking of is nope, I lost it. It'll probably come back in a second, but I think we're just about ready to call it a night. Does anybody else have one more thing they want to say? Please.
Yeah, I'm good with that, thanks, unless you need me to.
It's recording.
Okay.
Can you come forward a little bit?
I sure can. Okay, there we go. Yeah, my question is, what program or course that it currently isn't offered at CIIS do you guys wish that we had here, or if you have a course or a program, what would that be?
We've made a huge stride in the last few years with the founding of the Center for Psychedelic Medicine
Center for
Research.
Psychedelic Studies and Research.
Thank you.
And therapies and resesh. Sorry.
What's that?
Psychedelic therapies and research.
Yeah, it went through a series of modifications, but that was a big. That was something, and Stan Groff and I started teaching here together in '94, and I mean, that's something that we've been aware of for years, that it's just ridiculous that these powerful tools, technologies, medicines that have been part of humanity's spiritual evolution for thousands of years would be so blindly marginalized or punished for, et cetera. So that integration that's starting to happen in this last decade that's been a big plus. The one thing that's really nice about CIIS is, in most cases, if you think that a course is missing here, you can teach it. You propose it. I mean, if the students will come, you've got a course, and as long as it meets that kind of tension of opposites that we hold as our values here. I can't think of any. Matt, can you think of anything that, aside from what was made illegal in that one case of psychedelic medicine, what would be just is missing that isn't here, but we really direly wish it were here?
I'm quite happy with PCC, so.
Uh-huh.
But I was thinking psychedelics as well, and I hope that I mean, there's been such a renaissance around the psychedelic medicines because of how effective they are for PTSD and end-of-life anxiety and so on. And the certificate program right now is a great start, and I think as these medicines begin to be approved by the FDA, which is a few years away from happening, that CIIS can be at the forefront of training therapists to administer them. But also I hope that as the legal restrictions begin to lift, that the application of psychedelics to other forms of research will be something that we can explore. There's a rich creativity. There's a rich history of a lineage of philosophers who were ingesting various psychedelic substances that allowed them to expand their view of reality. And I think having an academically accredited program where we can, explore those heightened forms of consciousness in a philosophical way could really be groundbreaking. So we'll see what the next couple years bring.
Robert, you're the last question, and then
Very quickly, another question. This school needs more art.
Yeah.
Much more art. All the arts.
Mm-hmm.
Drama, music, dance, painting, sculpture, every kind of art. It's just much too much talk and not enough art.
Thank you, Rob.
well, you did do a course with me where we did the arts. Remember, we did it here, the Archetypes, Art and Culture class, where every class was music, film, etc. But it deeply needs to be integrated, and that reminds me of the one. Just before we end, the one missing theorist of and visionary of the evolution of consciousness I was mentioning, Teilhard and Aurobindo, et cetera. I missed saying Rudolf Steiner, who also played a very big role in our background of our thinking in CI and PCC. And then the very final thing, when I was talking to Ricky and I was trying to think of something and it leapt out of my mind and it came back. You're talking about Stanford and what it sometimes, in some sense, our competitor, sometimes it steals courses, et cetera. Well, it's all what goes around comes around, because it was Frederick Spiegelberg, professor at Stanford, who, without whom we would not be here. So, it all comes together in the long run. Please, Richard.
I would say in closing, I don't want to trip you here. We did an alumni survey not long ago and asked people for feedback or suggestions or memories, and one person said, "Stay strange."
Yes.
And the other person said, "More technology." So I think we have the bookend experiences here, and how great to hear from community members from two different generations. Thank you for a wonderful.
Thank you all.